Lena sat on the old wooden porch steps, her legs swinging as she watched the sunset paint the sky in soft pinks and oranges. The warm breeze carried the scent of fresh lavender from her grandmother's garden, and for a moment, everything felt safe, familiar. "Come inside, sweetie," Grandma Margaret called from the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's getting late." Lena hopped up, running inside the small house that smelled of cinnamon and old books, a scent that reminded her of comfort and home. Since her parents had passed away, it had been just the two of them, and Lena couldn't imagine life any other way. But that evening, everything changed. Her uncles, Raymond and Eleanor, arrived unannounced. They barely glanced at Lena as they stepped inside, their expressions stiff. Grandma Margaret greeted them politely, but Lena could sense something was wrong. They sat in the living room, speaking in hushed tones while Lena pretended to do her homework at the dining table. She couldn't make out every word, but she caught enough. "She can't take care of herself anymore," Raymond said, his voice low. "It's time to make a decision." Eleanor sighed. "She forgets things, Ray. What if she leaves the stove on? What if she wanders off?" "I do not," Grandma Margaret interrupted, her voice firm. "I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself and of Lena." But Eleanor countered with a fake sigh. "For how long?" "We only want what's best for you," Raymond added, his tone condescending. Lena's stomach twisted. She knew her grandmother better than anyone. Sure, sometimes she forgot where she left her glasses, but she wasn't incapable. She wasn't helpless. Then Raymond said something that made Lena's blood run cold. "The court hearing is next week. We've already filed for guardianship. Once it's official, we'll move you into a facility where you'll be taken care of." Lena's heart pounded. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about care. This was about money, and she was the only one who knew the truth. Lena lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. The soft ticking of the old clock in the hallway was the only sound in the house. But her mind was anything but quiet. Her uncles were trying to take Grandma Margaret away. They were going to put her in a facility and make it seem like she was too weak, too forgetful. But Lena knew the truth. This wasn't about her grandmother's health. It was about control, about money. She turned onto her side, clutching her blanket tightly. Grandma had always told her to be brave, to stand up for what was right. But how could she? She was just a kid. No one would listen to her. Still, she couldn't just do nothing. The next morning, Lena decided to test her theory. "Grandma, where do you keep your important papers?" she asked casually over breakfast, trying to keep her voice light. Grandma Margaret frowned, stirring her tea. "Why do you ask, sweetie?" Lena shrugged, pretending to be uninterested. "Just curious." Grandma smiled and playfully tapped Lena's nose. "Well, if you must know, I keep them in the sewing box in my closet, but there's nothing interesting there. Just old receipts and letters." Lena's heart skipped a beat. The sewing box. Later that day, when Grandma Margaret was outside tending to the garden, Lena slipped into the bedroom. The sewing box sat neatly on the shelf in the closet, just as Grandma had said. She opened it, sifting through bits of fabric and spools of thread until her fingers brushed against something different, an envelope. She pulled it out carefully and unfolded the paper inside. Her eyes widened as she read the shaky handwriting. "I, Margaret Whitmore, do not wish to be placed under guardianship. I am of sound mind and capable of making my own decisions." Lena's hands trembled. This was proof. If her grandmother had already written this, it meant she had suspected what was coming. Maybe she had even been pressured to sign something else, something she didn't agree with. Before Lena could think about what to do next, the front door creaked open. Eleanor's voice echoed through the house. "Lena!" Her stomach dropped. She quickly folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket. She had to act normal. She couldn't let them know what she had found. Not yet. Lena's hands felt clammy as she walked down the stairs, forcing a smile when she saw Eleanor in the kitchen. Lena's hands felt clammy as she walked down the stairs, forcing a smile when she saw Eleanor in the kitchen. "There you are," her aunt said, stirring sugar into her tea. "What have you been up to?" Lena shrugged, trying to sound casual. "Just playing in my room." Eleanor studied her for a moment before nodding. "Well, go wash up. We have some papers to go over with your grandmother." Lena's stomach twisted. Papers. She knew without a doubt that they were trying to force Grandma Margaret into signing something, probably something legal that would make it impossible for her to fight back. She had to stop them. That night, when the house was quiet, Lena pulled out the letter she had found. She read it over and over, the words sinking in. This paper proved that her grandmother was in her right mind. If only she could get someone to see it before it was too late. But who would believe her? Her teacher? No, this was a legal issue. The police? Would they even listen to a kid? Then it hit her. The court. If there was a hearing coming up, that meant a judge would be deciding what happened to her grandmother. Maybe, just maybe, if she could show the letter to the judge before Raymond and Eleanor could take control, Grandma would have a chance. Her heart pounded. It was a long shot, but it was her only idea. She just had to figure out how to get into that courtroom. The next morning after breakfast, Raymond and Eleanor sat down at the table with Grandma Margaret. They placed documents in front of her. "These are just formalities," Raymond said, sliding a pen toward her. "It'll make everything easier, Margaret." Grandma Margaret hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the paper. "Do I have to sign this?" she asked softly. Eleanor sighed dramatically. "Of course not, Margaret, but refusing won't change the fact that the court will see you as incapable. This is just making it official." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. This was manipulation, and she had to do something. "Grandma!" she blurted out before she could stop herself. "You don't have to sign anything you don't want to." All eyes turned to her. "This is an adult conversation," Eleanor snapped, her tone sharp. Lena swallowed hard but stood her ground. "She has a right to choose, doesn't she?" Grandma Margaret looked at Lena, her expression conflicted. Raymond exhaled sharply. "This isn't up for debate," he said, his voice hard. "The court will decide soon enough." Lena's heart raced. This was it. She had to act now. Lena's mind raced as she quickly moved toward the hallway, her pulse quickening with every step. She couldn't let them manipulate her grandmother like this. The letter? She needed to get it into the right hands. Her mind flashed to the courthouse she had seen last week, the one with the big stone pillars and the steps leading up to it. She knew where it was. It was just a matter of getting there. She couldn't go alone. She needed help, someone who would understand what was at stake. "Lena, wait!" Eleanor called after her, but Lena ignored her. She had to hurry. Eleanor's voice followed her as she ran outside. She could feel her aunt's eyes burning into her back. But there was no time to waste. She had to reach the courthouse before it was too late. Once outside, Lena took a deep breath, her legs feeling shaky from the rush. She started down the street, her mind set on one thing: getting to that courthouse. As she walked, she thought about her grandmother. She knew she had to do this not just for her, but for everyone who might fall victim to people like Raymond and Eleanor. The courthouse was closer than she thought. Soon she stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at the grand building. For a moment, doubt crept into her mind. What if no one believed her? But she couldn't back down now. She had come this far. She clenched the letter tightly in her hand and began to climb the steps. Inside, the air was thick with tension, and the large room echoed with the murmur of voices. Lena's eyes darted around, searching for someone who could help her. "Can I help you?" a voice asked, interrupting her thoughts. Lena turned to see a kind-looking woman standing nearby. Lena hesitated, unsure of what to say. I need to see a judge," she stammered. "It's about my grandmother. She's being tricked, and I have proof." The woman's expression softened. "I think we can help you. Follow me." Lena followed the woman down a long hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. She was finally going to do something. The woman led Lena to a small office and gestured for her to sit. "You'll be fine," she said softly. "Just tell the judge the truth. That's all you can do." Lena sat down, trying to calm her racing heart. The weight of the letter in her pocket felt heavy, but it was also her only hope. She needed to be strong. A few minutes later, the door opened, and a man in a dark suit walked in. The woman stood up and nodded at Lena, signaling for her to follow. Lena stood up and followed her. As they walked toward the courtroom, she could hear the low murmur of voices and the distant clatter of footsteps. Her hands were clammy, but she refused to back down. They reached the door and the woman opened it, stepping aside to let Lena enter. Lena took a deep breath and walked inside. The room was filled with people, but her eyes immediately found her grandmother. Her grandmother sat at a long table, looking small and fragile. But when she saw Lena, a soft smile spread across her face. For the first time in days, Lena felt a little less afraid. Lena walked up to her grandmother and sat down beside her. The judge was looking at her now, waiting for her to speak. "Your Honor," Lena began, her voice steady but quiet, "I have something to say about my grandmother's guardianship." The judge nodded for her to continue. "Go ahead, young lady." Lena took a deep breath and pulled the letter from her pocket. "This is a letter my grandmother wrote. She doesn't want a guardian. She's perfectly capable of taking care of herself." The courtroom fell silent. Everyone turned to look at Lena, and even Raymond and Eleanor were staring at her, their faces a mix of disbelief and anger. The judge took the letter and read it carefully. After a few moments, he set it down and looked at Lena. "How did you come by this letter?" he asked. Lena hesitated for a moment before answering. "I found it in my grandmother's sewing box," she said, her voice steady. "I knew something wasn't right, so I went looking. I had to show you." There was a long pause as the judge considered her words. Finally, he looked up and addressed Raymond and Eleanor. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," the judge began, "is what your niece says true? Were you planning to manipulate your mother into giving up her independence?" Raymond shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We only want what's best for her," he muttered. "I see," the judge said, his voice firm. "Well, based on the evidence presented, I have no choice but to deny the guardianship petition. Mrs. Whitmore is of sound mind and capable of making her own decisions." Lena felt a wave of relief wash over her as she looked at her grandmother. Marjorie smiled, her eyes brimming with tears of gratitude. "Thank you," Marjorie whispered, taking Lena's hand in hers. "You saved me." Lena and Marjorie stood up together as the judge called the case closed. As they walked out of the courtroom, the weight that had been on Lena's shoulders for days seemed to lift. Outside, the sunlight was brighter than Lena remembered. It was almost as if the world had shifted, the air lighter and easier to breathe. Charles felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. It was Elise. "Thank you, Lena," Marjorie said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "You've given me my life back." Lena smiled, her eyes misty. "I couldn't have done it without you, Grandma." They walked slowly to the car, and Lena felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't just the case being over. It was the realization that she had fought for something that truly mattered. As they got in the car, Marjorie turned to her. "I know it wasn't easy. I've seen what they've tried to do. But you stood up for me." Lena took a deep breath, the weight of her actions still settling in her chest. "I couldn't just let them take everything from you, Grandma. Not when you still have so much to give." Marjorie smiled again, a warm, loving expression. "You've always been strong, Lena. I'm so proud of you." As they drove home, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the road. But for the first time in a long while, Lena didn't feel weighed down by the darkness. At home, they settled down in the living room. Marjorie sat in her favorite armchair, and Lena sat next to her, feeling the warmth of her grandmother's presence. "What happens now, Grandma?" Lena asked quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. Marjorie looked at her thoughtfully. "Well, I think it's time for me to go back to doing what I love. I've missed gardening, and there's so much I've put off." Lena grinned. "And I'll help you with all of it. Whatever you need, I'm here." Marjorie chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "That's the spirit. You've always been there for me." For the rest of the day, they worked together to clean up the garden, just as they had done when Lena was a little girl. The sense of normalcy was overwhelming. It felt like they were reclaiming their lives, step by step. As the sun set, Lena sat beside her grandmother, watching the colors in the sky shift from gold to pink. She knew that the road ahead would have its challenges, but for now she was content. "Grandma," Lena whispered, "we'll face everything together, right?" Marjorie smiled, a contented, peaceful smile. "Always, my dear, always."